here. I said to Gabriella that, I mean, I'm not actually working with producing digital content for Limerick at the moment, so I wasn't sure if I should be speaking, but she asked me to say a word because of my more general interest in people and technology over the years. So, I mean, these are some comments based on, you know, being involved in teaching up at UL, kind of people about digital media, and also in our research group, the Interaction Design Centre, where Gabriella and Louis and Michael and others and myself have been involved in looking at, you know, how to augment spaces with technology. So I think one of the things to say is, you know, how do we try to make sense of these things? And what I wanted to argue is that sometimes, you know, we have this mix of the physical world and the digital world, and in some cases the way this is talked about, I find, and the way people think about it, is potentially problematic, which is suddenly kind of focusing on the differences and on suddenly saying everything has changed. So we have this idea for some people that, you know, oh, the world is completely different to what it was, and therefore it emphasizes difference. So we now have, you know, the immaterial, digital, you know, we have to look at, you know, people have changed everything, so they're now digital, we have these kids growing up who are digital natives, some new species that we have to look at. And, you know, the revolution in terms of things are changing totally in terms of Twitter and Facebook and how, so certainly I'm not trying to argue that the world hasn't, or what people do in terms of some of their activities hasn't changed, but what I'm saying is in terms of trying to analyze or understand that in certain cases, I think this emphasis on difference can actually be overdone. So I mean, you know, the fact that people are now, you know, the occurrence of flash mobs and things like that, which can be done through you know, mobile technology, certainly that's something that couldn't have been done before in the same way. But I think, as I said, there's a danger that we can over-accentuate the fact that about some of these differences and forget the commonalities in a way that we still have in terms of people, whether they're old or young, you know, using technology or not using it, in the sense that some of the basic concerns that we have in terms of, you know, what do we want out of life, what do we want to do? We want to play sport, we want to connect with our friends, we want to, you know, find out information, which certainly now, you know, we can Google it, etc. I mean, the technology has changed, but I mean, some of the activities we're doing, we want to find partners, socialize, etc., are still there. And we still have a body, you know, we're not, we haven't disappeared physically, and we are physically in place, we're physically somewhere in places, not just in these electronic spaces. And in that sense, I'm not sure, I think probably Louis, who's been involved in Regina Chalafi, would probably say a bit more about her interest in space and place. So the point is in a sense, in certain ways, in terms of, as I said, looking at things, if we start out with this idea of this distinction of these two completely different worlds, the physical and the digital, I think in some cases it's not necessarily the most interesting way. It's important also at times to also look at the fact that, you know, how do we perform our activities, and how might some of those activities now be augmented with the technology that's possible. So rather than replacement, it's kind of or substitution, we think about augmentation in various ways. And I think that kind of, so this sort of duality, it has implications in terms of thinking about, like we say about Limerick, or doing something for Limerick. So it's not just kind of what's online in Limerick, but it's rather, you know, how is it from the point of view, the perspective of different sorts of people, whether it's local inhabitants or whether it's visitors or whatever, who come to Limerick or potentially coming. Of course, then you want to have some online information. But as I said, we shouldn't just start out with this idea that it's necessarily of thinking of these two separate worlds. I think it's quite important for people that we try to think about how we might integrate these. So how do we use these new media in a way to create interesting new conversations and explorations of the place itself? Now, I think, as I say, some of the other talks I'm going to focus more on particular instantiations and kind of what the technology can do. I mean, I don't know, for instance, I mean, the thing is to be aware also, I'm very happy to hear about just our previous speaker talking about what the city council is doing, which is very good news. But this idea of, you know, open data, you mentioned in the last point on your slide, the open data initiative, and I mean, that's an interesting area in terms of how potentially we can start to think about new sorts of activities around around what, how we interact. And I was just thinking though that to be aware that there are resources around to support some of these activities. So for instance, I don't know if any of you know that next Monday there's a free event on up in Dublin. Here is a concern about place, having to go up there to it, but it's on enterprising open data, for instance. The game is on, it's organised by this initiative called Inventorium. I don't know if any of you have come across it, been aware of it. It's an initiative to try and encourage kind of new enterprises, new ideas, and they host a number of events. So this one is actually on open data. People like Mary Mulvihill and others are speaking there in terms of educational gaming. So as I say, I think it's really interesting. Looking forward to hearing some of the examples and the experiments that people are doing. But my point in a couple of minutes was just, as I say, to realise that there are different ways in which we can frame these issues to discuss them, and they don't all are necessarily starting out with this idea that kind of, like these two completely separate worlds which is often the case in terms of talking about new technology, can be problematic. And in that sense, I actually quite like our label here, Connecting Limerick, because it's around place. So, thank you.
Thank you.